Now, it's important to note that a very, very prehistoric common ancestor, known as the canoflagellates, they are unicellular. Eventually diverged into a common ancestor here and a common ancestor over here. This one diverged into other protists and plants. Now, what it's important to note here is this common ancestor that came from the same common ancestor of the canoflagellates branched off into fungi and animals. Why is this interesting? Because animals and fungi are actually more closely related than fungi are to plants. Plants are actually more closely related to other protists. Why am I making that disclaimer? Let me explain why. I'm bringing this up because when we looked at in the previous video of one of the organelles, the centriole, we identified it to be only found in animal cells. But if you want to get extremely specific, it's actually in protists too. In case you're not very adept with what protists are, I know I mentioned like Euglena before. If you don't know what that is, I'm sure you've heard of paramecium, right? So paramecium could be an example, right? And paramecium, I believe, have centriole as well. I think trypanosoma have them too. Trypanosoma, I think it's OSOMA, don't quote me on it, but I think it's trypanosoma, okay? So paramecium, trypanosoma are protists that have a centriole. Again, I'll explain why this is relevant after I write out the next few sentences, okay? So just also important to note here in a star that plants and fungi have MTOCs. Okay, so these are pretty much like microtubule, like organizing centers, and typically all eukaryotic cells, so plants, animals, fungi, they all have it. Okay, but it just works and functions differently. So we typically use in specific types of literature that MTOCs are only really used within plants, okay, even though they are present in animals too. Animals, they use the MTOCs a little bit differently because they have centromeres and centrosomes in order to help with division. Plants, they solely use this heavily in order to help with division. I also want to start here bacteria and archaea. So these are very, very different organisms in a completely different domain than eukaryotes. They have no membrane-bound organelles. So all those things that we looked at, membrane-bound organelles, that we looked at in the previous video, most of those are membrane-bound organelles. Bacteria and archaea do not have any. Now, why do I say most? Because the ribosome, right, that we looked at, that is necessary for protein synthesis, obviously they have to be found within archaea and bacteria, because otherwise they wouldn't be living, right? Because they need to protein synthesize. We need protein to be constructed and built. Otherwise, the life wouldn't be able to exist. So ribosome is not membrane bound. So they obviously, they have them. Cytoplasm, that gel that holds things together, they need that too. And a cell membrane. And the last thing I want to write before I summarize this here is cilia and flagella, right? The last thing that we looked at in the previous video. only animals and protists have cilia and flagella. Like I said before, right? The paramecium, the trypanosoma, the eugellina, okay? Eugellina as well, and paramecium too, right? Trypanosoma, okay? These protists, along with animals, have cilia and flagella. Now, there are some other exceptions too that actually have cilia and flagella as well. So, like some fungi, but it's very rare. I think it's lower levels of fungi. So, lower level fungi have them too. I think it's like some sort of spore. I forget which type. I think it's I don't remember, but it's a type of spore. I think it's a zoospore that has cilia and flagella, and lower level plants too. That have a history of being very, very prehistoric, like mosses and ferns. They have cilia and flagella too. And I could kind of explain why, but we're not going to get into the evolutionary biology too deep into detail, so I don't want to take too much time out of this video to dive into their roots as to why they would need cilia and flagella to be on shore. But just in hindsight, just have in the back of your mind that it's normally just the animals and the protists that have cilia and flagella. We can get to the evolutionary biology a little bit later on in the other units. Now, the pressing question after writing all of this stuff down, take a moment to read through it and answer this question in your head. How can fungi and animals be closer related considering the evidence on the left? So what do I mean by that? So when we looked at over here, we looked at how only animals and actually the protists have a centriole. So that's one point where animals and maybe the protists over here should actually be in the same tree. Okay, so shouldn't protists actually be over here? Okay, but in our actual diagram, they're in a completely different taxonomical tree. They're in its own separate clade. So why is animal and protists so far away from each other when they actually both have a centriole? Isn't that kind of odd? Another thing for you to focus on is plants and fungi. Plants and fungi have MTOCs functioning in a particular way, very different than how animals and protists do. But plants and fungi, again, in a very, very different taxonomical tree. Plants are over here, fungi are over here. They're actually very, very far away from each other. Even though that they're standing right next to each other, because their common ancestor goes all the way up to here. It's actually very, very far away. It doesn't branch off from there. It branches off all the way up there. So they're actually very, very different. But they have a very similar trait in that MTOC. So how is this making sense right now? Let's look at cilia and flagella as well. It seems that only animals and protists have cilia and flagella. Again, animals over here, protists over here. They're very, very far from each other, just as far away as fungi and plants are from one another. So what is going on? Shouldn't animals and fungi be a lot more closely related? What's going on? Hopefully this kind of blows your mind away. Fungi, particularly more advanced fungi, had cilia and flagella. But as time went on, it seemed to have been overly taxing in terms of energy to have that feature. So because of that, they started to lose it. And only certain types of fungi, very, very rare ones, like the lower level fungi, were able to actually keep them. But the vast majority of the fungi didn't seem to thrive in an environment to keep it. It was actually more taxing to keep it. So as time went on, they started to lose it, and most of the fungi that you see now do not have cilia and flagella. Again, only the rare ones do. Very similar to an analogy with ostriches and penguins, because most birds fly, but ostriches do not fly, penguins do not fly, but I guess their ancestors all did, or their more closely related ancestors not too far back in time did. Why? To evade predation, but perhaps due to its ecological niches that it belonged in or its environment that it belonged in, it didn't seem necessary to find the need to fly anymore to evade predators. And it seemed a lot more reasonable in terms of trade off to not fly and save that energy to do other things, like caring for offspring or making more offspring, for example. So, the fungi that we see nowadays, again, with exception to these ones, the fungi that we see nowadays don't necessarily need that much motility with cilia and flagella. So, it would make sense that fungi and animals are actually side by side, because like I said, the advanced ones all had cilia and flagella. It just, we're looking at a retrospect snapshot in time right now where it might seem that they don't have many similarities. But if you trace it back far enough, most of them actually were very, very similar to animals. And it's actually why fungi, right, a certain group of them, like the mushrooms, right, of the fungi, they taste kind of meaty compared to like plants. They don't necessarily taste like plants because their ancestor, whoever was here, and their ancestors before had similar texture and feel. And actually, fungi are actually heterotrophs. They don't actually photosynthesize. They actually have a mutualistic relationship with trees. So they consume food in order to survive, exactly what animals do. And if you want to get even more hazy, okay, because there's a lot of nuance into this, right? Not everything's clear cut, and we can't really see it in particular uh, in this retrospect moment in time without looking at the previous evidence that we have at our disposal. Technically, these kinoflagellates, they're unicellular protists. So if you think about it, this whole section over here can be a little bit hazy and a little bit gray because these protists are actually the most farthest back common ancestor that pertains to this particular topic over here. And even though a lot of them, its descendants that we're focusing on today here, is in that section of the phylogenetic tree, it all, the plants, the fungi and animals, all seem to have come from a common ancestor that resembled more like a protist. Now, before that, we're not going to get into that deep of a detail, but in the scope of where we are right now, it's relevant to make that point that the protist-like common ancestor to all of them was the starting point. And as time went on, certain types of organelles, this one, right, the MTOC, the centriole, started to get lost or got refined depending on the uses and needs of that particular organism. So I guess I'll just put over here fungi ancestors. Did have cilia and flagella, but lost them due to unnecessary need of added motility. It just was not worth it. Plus the common ancestor of them all above. Protist-like. meaning the organelles are in a gray area.